Good afternoon. Is it the end of the road for the motorcar or for the automobile? My name's Niall Crowley. I'm the producer and chair. Yeah, the motorcar that shaped so much of the 20th century social and cultural life and came to symbolise Western prosperity and freedom. In the 21st century, however, the dream of the motorcar seems to be running out of gas. So that's kind of what we're here to discuss. Kicking us off will be, on my right, is Timandra Harkness, who's a journalist, writer, broadcaster, presenter of Radio 4's FutureProofing and How to Disagree, and the author of Big Data, Does Size Matter, amongst other books, I think. Second will be Nigel Ruddock, who's on my left. Nigel's an accountant, an insolvency specialist, trustee, former head and chairman of Automotive Services, Grant Thornton. And then thirdly is Simon Nash. Simon's an environmentalist, speaker, activist, and founder of Green Oil Bicycle Lubes. And finally, we have Hilton Holloway. He's the founder of the brilliant 5054 magazine, which I highly recommend. He's an automotive industry writer and specialist and a future tech specialist, and he's the author of one of the Academy of Ideas pamphlets on, is it the Freedom of the Open Road or something? Timandra, would you like to kick us off?
Okay, so I'm Timandra. I own a fleet of 3 vehicles, a bicycle, a motorcycle and a car, which obviously I can't use all of them at once. It's slightly excessive, to be honest, but I have all options covered. Is it the end of the road for the automobile? Well, I was thinking about this and thinking about the direction that the automobile is going, if you like, and some of the things I've seen which look like being part of the future. One of them is obviously going to different fuels, so the idea that motor cars would be hybrid or electric, and this seems like a direction we're moving. I don't know how quickly. There are still some issues with this. There's supply problems, materials, and so on. But yeah, as someone who lives in a city next to a main road, I quite like the idea that cars, certainly in cities, will be electric drive. But I think in a way that's quite a small change. The bigger change, I think, possibly is that cars could drive themselves. I've always been a bit of a skeptic about this, having once been driven in a self-driving car, as it were, in Singapore on a very orderly road on a university campus, where even so the car just about managed most of the time. And then I flew back and got a taxi from Heathrow to southeast London, where I'm living, and looked out of the window and thought, there is no AI on the planet that could manage this. There's vehicles coming from all directions, driven by people who learnt to drive in wildly differing road conditions and conventions. There's bicycles ridden by people who've had no formal training at all. There's pedestrians. It's absolute mayhem. Driving is a social skill. It's not just a matter of moving an object in space. But they are getting better. My initial mistake was I thought, well, I don't see how self-driving cars can ever share the road with human drivers. And then I realised, of course, that was never the plan. The plan was to get rid of human drivers and only have autonomous vehicles, which would be the end not of the automobile but of the driver. So that made me think about what it is that we value about automobiles. And I realised in London especially, a lot of people do manage without owning an automobile, although I would put it to you that there's very few people who... Actually, could I just ask, who in the room does not drive ever an automobile? Okay, so there's quite a few of you. So I would be very surprised if any of you said, I have not been in an automobile in the last 10 years or so. And I think most people who don't own one, and I go in and out of owning them, nevertheless use taxis, get lifts. It's not something that's not in my life at all. So I would suggest this is true of most of us. But I think that on the whole, what we value about the automobile, whatever our level of involvement, is 2 things. One of them is simply mobility. And it's that, and in that role, it is part of a whole range of options. So, You know, like me, you might choose between a bicycle, a car, possibly a motorbike, public transport, depending on walking, obviously, depending on where you're going to, how much of a hurry you're in, whether you've got other people with you, all these things. And the other one is a bit more nebulous and a bit more, I would say, maybe imperiled, which is the feeling of independence and autonomy. Because when we get to the position where cars can properly drive themselves reliably and not requiring any driving skill on behalf of what will then be the passenger, and I think we will get there. I think it'll be a while, but I think we will get there. Then you will generally have the option of almost living as if you had a chauffeur or a taxi driver on permanent call. So you could get to wherever you wanted to, whenever you wanted to. This is part of the appeal of the reason I own a car at the moment is because I need to be able to get to where I need to get without any notice, from door to door, away from public transport provision. That's why I have a car instead of just hiring one when I need one. Self-driving cars potentially could take that away, but what they couldn't replace is the fact that if I'm driving a car or using a motorcycle or to some extent cycling, I am responsible for myself. I am moving myself. But more so in a car or in any kind of motor vehicle, I'm responsible for my own movement and my own safety and the safety of other humans around me. And this is something that we have less and less, most of us, we have less and less chance to have that in our lives. We tend to live quite safe and constrained and routinized lives where, I realise, again, this depends on your occupation, but for most of us, day-to-day decisions that we make don't have life or death effects on other people. Driving is an exception to that. Now, the downside to that, obviously, is that people mess up, people die in road accidents, and that's clearly a bad thing. So I think, there's an argument that if you take the human driver out of that loop, you save lives and we're all safer. But I do think, and this is where I think it becomes very nebulous and difficult, every time we make our lives safer and more controlled, we lose something in terms of our own capacities and our abilities and our willingness, that muscle, if you like, of taking responsibility and judging risk and trying to attain safety by judging risk right, rather than by putting in place a whole machinery that keeps us safe. So I think we will still want mobility. We'll still want to be able to move around, but how we will have that sense of autonomy and being responsible for ourselves, I don't know.
Great. Thank you for that excellent start. Nigel, can you give us your thoughts, please? Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Noel. Is it the end of the road for the automobile? No. I think the car is going to continue to be essential for many people, and I don't see a credible alternative in the foreseeable future. But I think net zero will have a big impact, and the importance of the car will diminish. And that's both functionally and, to address Timandra's point, also as a cultural icon. I think the car is going to become very, very boring as technology actually bites on it. The end of the American dream, possibly. Firstly, though, if you look at electric vehicles, this is where probably a lot of the debate's going to centre. I think you need to think of an electric vehicle as essentially being assembled. It's like a skateboard. You've got the batteries on the platform, you've got the wheels at either corner with the motors. From a design perspective, the rest of the space above is free. If you think of a petrol car, you've got a big engine, the exhaust system and the petrol tank, and obviously you've got a lot of safety considerations around those, and that's what drives the design of a current car. That all falls away with an EV. And I think if you couple that with the huge advances that we've got in technology at the moment, like the sat-nav, digital display, vehicle connectivity, etc., you've got a vast array of design possibilities that start to emerge that perhaps weren't around 10 years ago. So the sort of things that could come out of that is you could have much shorter production runs for vehicles. It potentially opens up to much cheaper, customised vehicles for very, very specific tasks. So an example of that could be you go to the airport, you drive to the airport car park, you get out your car, and there is a dedicated driverless vehicle there for you, specifically designed to take you to the terminal. So it's got plenty of room for 4 people and the luggage. You get in it, your car's taken away to be parked, see it in a couple of weeks hopefully. And while you're in the vehicle going to the terminal, you're checked in. It's got all the technology there to do that. It's also got security protocols in it that's sniffing all the air and checking for explosives and all that sort of stuff. You get to the terminal, you're checked in, you go in, the car carries on to baggage handling, and hopefully you'll see your bags when you turn up at the other end. So far more efficient, driven by this sort of shorter production run and the idea of lots of design space. And I think you'll see a lot more of those sorts of dedicated driverless vehicles coming into all sorts of scenarios. I think you're also going to see a lot of challenge coming from the car from the two wheels, e-scooters. Somewhere like Bristol, very, very difficult to get to the centre by car now. It's very much a pedestrianised city, and there's e-scooters for very cheap hire all over the place, and it's become, seems to me, certainly in the summer, pretty acceptable that you use these scooters to get around. You see them right out by the docks, right by the industrial estate. It's not just in the centre of Bristol, and you see it in London as well. And I think you're going to see a lot more of that. E-bikes, obviously, and perhaps in terms of the substitution point, traditionally the family would have gone to Sainsbury's once a week in the car, make a big shop. Now it gets to Wednesday night, what we're going to have for dinner. You ring up Deliveroo, and someone on an e-bike or a conventional bicycle turns up with your dinner. There's a substitution that's actually gone on there, as well as the change in buying habits. So there are a lot of changes along those lines. In terms of public transport, I don't think you're going to see a huge amount of extra capacity coming out of this, but I think the technology will mean there'll be a lot more slicker and easier to use ticketing, a lot more understanding about capacity and loading, so it's much easier to plan your journey from start to finish. It'll integrate the bus and the train and whatever else in a way that is actually quite clunky at the moment. So I think public transport will probably take more capacity in the future. So I think there's, and of course you've then got drone technology and robotics. Amazon are already testing these sort of things for delivery. So I think there's going to be lots of different ways that the dominance of the car is going to be nibbled away at over time. But we haven't got the grid capacity to transition to electric vehicles. That is a major problem, and in all the discussion around net zero, governments aren't really facing up to that. So there's a big health warning on how quickly this is going to come. You've also got the fact that the car manufacturers have got to transition, and this is a major, major transition they've got to make. Car manufacture at the moment employs a lot of very expensive, highly skilled engineers that, broadly speaking, won't be needed in the future. And again, I don't think governments are really facing up to the job losses that's going to come out of this transition. And we've just heard BMW announcing that the electric Mini is now going to go to China. So it's not even a job reduction in the UK, it's a complete wipeout of that line going forward for the Mini. So there's a lot of political stuff that's going to come in here, and this is going to impact. And I think also what we've seen is the market for manufacturing vehicles is going to open up to new entrants. Tesla is a new entrant. You know, its market cap is bigger than most of the other traditional manufacturers put together. And the manufacturers in the future are actually going to be software and design they're going to be the key competencies they need, not so much engineering. So there's a big cultural shift that's gone on there. Silicon Valley moving away from Detroit, that sort of thing. So there's changes coming there, and I think the final thought that leads me to is regulation is key to all of this. So what I've spoken about is how the transition could work. Governments have signed up to net zero. I'm not sure they've quite thought through the consequences, and I think as those consequences start to hit, particularly in the economic environment we're likely to be facing over the next few years, these big job losses and all the rest of it, my question is, will they use regulation to promote innovation for all these new technologies and really encourage them, or will they use regulation to actually slow them down to protect their traditional industries? Finish on that point.
Thank you. Lots to think about. Simon, can you give us your thoughts or your perspective?
Yeah, now one of the great things I must say about the battle of ideas is you can completely disagree with someone and still be friends afterwards. And I'll remind everyone that when I say this, I quite like electric scooters. I think they are part of the transport future, and I think they will lead to the decline, even the end of the road of the automobile in town centres. But let's see the other side of it. Now imagine for a moment the freedom of the car, the open road, the imaginary cityscape, empty streets, swept by autumn leaves. The woman and the handsome man smile at you as you drive past. But in reality, everyone else had the same idea that Sunday morning. The road is blocked, the city is full of fumes, and the beautiful people scowl at you as the pollution caused by your now car is annoying them and it's covered in soot. This is the reality, unfortunately. The car adverts have been lying. And let's talk about the problem of the car. Like air pollution, so 40,000 premature deaths a year, according to the Royal College of Physicians, from air pollution in the UK, 40,000 lives. Climate change, I think climate change is a problem. It causes poverty in other countries, rains, floods, extreme heat, and road transport is responsible for 27% of UK carbon emissions. And cars are a big part of that. Oil dependency is a patriotic reason to perhaps accelerate the decline of the automobile. We're a net importer of oil. That means money leaving the country. Of course, no politicians talk about the balance of payments anymore. I think that should come back on the agenda, and actually cars are almost draining the economy by relying on the import of oil currently. Health again, people are obsessed by the NHS, save the NHS, give more money to the NHS. Well, obesity costs the NHS £6.5 billion a year, and car use is the largest cause of obesity. If you're running for a bus or cycling or even a bit chilly on an e-scooter, you're going to be a lot healthier. So I think for a healthier Great Britain, car use should be cut a lot. Now, low traffic neighbourhoods, a controversial subject. Mind you, again, we can be friends afterwards and disagree. They've made the 90s and the 80s reclaim the streets protests a reality. Streets have been reclaimed by plants and for children to play in away from cars. They've made cycling safer in town centres, and it has made e-scooters a great transport solution. I would say it's a curious fact that we have this body called Parliament who seems to exist to just keep making more and more laws. You sort of take it to its logical conclusion. Everything would eventually be illegal if they keep passing more laws. And the reason for Parliament is to pass laws for new technologies. That's the justification for Parliament, and rightly so. They failed to legalise e-scooters, and that's just a failure of government and not a reason to not embrace e-scooters, which fulfil the task of a car, which is to move a human from one place to another. Another solution to the problem of the car is actually mini mobility, or actually smaller cars. Now, amongst you are the intellectual elites. Perhaps you've never worked on a farm or at a festival. But at these places, you get these small sort of farm vehicles, almost like a giant's golf cart. They're speed limited to 15 or 25 miles an hour. And you don't even need a driving license. I think you can drive them from the age of 12. These are ideal for town centres when vehicles are slow moving. The fact they are slow moving means you don't need the tons of metal, the airbags, all the padding. You don't need any of that. And according to McKinsey, this kind of mini mobility, these small, very small electric vehicles that don't require a license, could be a $300 to $500 million market. And there's no reason to have a car that goes at 70 miles an hour in a town centre. In fact, it'd be illegal to take it up to that speed limit. So perhaps you don't need all the things around the car and the tons of metal around you. Cycling is great. Bicycles make people fit and save them money. Cars do the opposite. They make you fat and cost you money. So the decline of the automobile is great for your wallet as well. We do, of course, live in a very rich country. It's easy to forget that. Most people are not choosing between heating and eating, as the media like to promote. They're choosing to drive their car to the gym, to then sit on a bicycle in the gym to lose the calories which they have gained from driving a car too much. And then whilst riding the bicycle in the gym, they're probably watching a TV screen of somebody driving a car to the gym. It's madness, and I think people should just ride a bicycle in the first place. E-scooters and bicycles carry out the main role of a car, as I say, which is moving one human. You have cargo bicycles now. which are great. And you can see couriers from DHL to UPS using these semi-electric bikes to carry huge loads. Freddy's Flowers, the delivery company, flowers, they have like 100 boxes of flowers on one bicycle, negating the necessity of the automobile. I do think we're in a very wealthy country. I do think some of the aspects we've lost are the sense of community. That's one of the downsides of a country being richer. We can recreate that community. I do think public transport, you know, there were lots of signs on the bus almost criminalising talking to someone on the bus these days. But I do think buses and public transport do create a sense of community. You might meet your neighbours, you might make new friends. Someone's got a dog, you might stroke the dog and start a conversation. This community aspect to public transport is very positive, and that's lost if you're in a metal box in your car. Is it the end of the road for the automobile? Well, in town centres, yes it is, and literally it is the case, because the end of the road has a nice low traffic neighbourhood plant plot at the end of it. So in terms of health, national income, and children wanting to breathe and play, we all benefit.
Great. Thank you very much. Hilton, sorry.
Right.
Off you go.
Right. Well, I probably at this point should admit, if that's the right word, that many years ago, I was a bicycle journalist. I went everywhere by bicycle. I did design some bicycles, and I was involved in getting the Boris bus off the ground. So I'm not a complete petrol head, you know, to the idea that everybody should drive. But the thing, the approach I'm taking to this question is the end of the automobile. What worries me is the reduction of choice. Reduction of choice is coming massively into fashion, I think, and the clown circus across the road here. In the last few days, we've had a big question mark over whether a government can choose to do certain things economically without the whole of the world coming in and saying, no, you can't do that. We're not going to let you do it. And I think that, I'm seeing this reduction of choice, and I've been in London. Well, we've just left after 29 years in Zone 2, and I've watched London change from a place that was, when I arrived in '93, it was like a Formula One circuit. Everybody drove really quickly and professionally, and now we're in a town where the roads are ever narrower and the queues are ever longer. And of course, this is the crucible of trying to get people out of their cars. And with 8,000 or 7,000 buses and a tube system and a rail system, you'd have thought that you could manage that here. And what worries me about what's happening is that really they're trying to stop you driving altogether. So with your low traffic neighbourhoods, is that it's just generally turning the screw and trying to make driving more and more inconvenient. And I think that, if you take, for example, what's happening in London, I had a meeting with at the end of the Boris term, I had a meeting with the GLA and TfL, and my advice to them was, please don't cause congestion in a city full of diesel vehicles. Because at the time, nobody was paying attention to pollution and only talking about CO2. And now, you only have to see what happens outside. And other things that are happening in London, which they will try and, which will spread across the country. I mean, putting in 20-mile-an-hour speed limits as some kind of real motoring suppressing serious thing, it was laughable. Can I drive at 20 miles an hour in London? Is that a guarantee? Because that would be fantastic. Because I can't. And then the police have also turned up the heat. And I have a friend in Central who got 2 speeding tickets for 23 miles an hour within 20 minutes. And that's really quite, that's quite zealous. So if you've got a city with a lot of unsolved crime, a lot of street crime, and yet you're doing a very good job of jumping on the motorists, I just don't think that's a very good signal to be sending. And I think the other thing is that if you have a London view, I think you can forget what the rest of the country is like. So now I'm not in London after 29 years, and I see a tweet from the riverboat service, which used to stop at Battersea. And one recent one was an apology for the lack of a drinks bar on the next service. And I thought, if I was a shop assistant in Bolton, waiting in the rain for a bus, and I read that, I'd explode, because the choice is standing at the bus stop in Bolton, and whether you've got a drinks bar when you get on the boat home to Putney. So, London is so exceptional in its choice that it really isn't an example of anything. I don't think you can use what's happening in London or the experiments in London as something for the rest of the country. And also expanding that issue of the lack of choice, as Nigel was saying, with the move to electric vehicles. Boris got completely carried away and said he's going to ban anything with an engine by 2030. I mean, that is literally put the entire existence of Jaguar Land Rover under threat, because it's not something they could do, and it's a huge employer and one of the biggest places for R&D. And that might not happen, but you need to look at the small print that's being, as you were saying, the laws that are being created across the road. The new government has commissioned new standard roadside charges. What they can do by law is turn them off at peak hours. So drivers have no choice in the matter of whether they can recharge or whether a plan that they had, that's going to go out the window. And also, near future EVs, and I mean the first one will be the new Volvo flagship EV. Near future EVs will be bidirectional, which allows the national grid to suck power out of your battery when the wind turbines slow down. And there's no choice in that either. And that's kind of related to the smart meter issue of instant charging. And another thing I'd just like to address is that moving to EVs is going to put freedom of the road beyond many in the future, I mean, quite seriously. So because of the way the markets work, as we know, the global market says one thing and you've all got to line up behind it, is that very few automotive bosses are actually saying, this can't be done, it's not going to happen. They've got to say, yes, it's going to happen, we're all behind it, otherwise the value of their company is going to go down. But there are two people, one French, one Portuguese, who've actually come out and said, this is going to be a disaster for ordinary people's freedom. So the boss of Citroën recently told Autocar, the average transaction price of a fossil fuel car today is 25,000 euros. But for an EV, it's over 40,000 euros. And his boss, the boss of the Stellantis group, Tavares, has also said straight up that the cost of electrifying cars is going to add 50% to the cost of building a vehicle. And he said there's no way we can transfer 50% of cost to the final consumer because most parts of the middle class won't be able to pay. Now, he's being quite honest there. And all that's been happening in recent years is that while the battery price was supposed to come down to $100 per kilowatt hour, it's in fact gone completely the other way because lithium prices have gone through the roof and may not stop for some time. So in a sense, if you're only allowed to buy an EV, your choice on where you can go, when you can go, how far you can go, what weather you can drive in, will be defined by the size of the battery you can afford. And as a sort of final point, I've long believed that the autonomy of an ordinary car has been responsible for the single biggest uplift in working class well-being. And I grew up in a very poor industrial town, and people just didn't have a choice in their job or their wages or where they lived, or if they went on holiday, if at all. But they seized on the car because it gave them some choice, control, personal autonomy, and big leap in the quality of life. You became, at least in one area, a master of your own destiny. And I don't think the car's going to die because freedom of choice is out of the bottle and it won't be ever put back in. And I've finally got to put my hand up, when it comes to electrification. And I've written here, the elites have a mad vision of digging up half of Africa and South America to save the planet. Well, I can assure you, that what we're doing, and in fact this is the point you're making, is that we're trying to build EVs for relatively well-off people that pretty much replicate your Range Rover. Trouble is the car is 3 tons. In Germany, they're saying the central barriers on the motorway won't hold the vehicles. You may end up, in fact, you may end up with lots of people not being able to drive the cars because they need a license for a heavier vehicle. So there's going to be a bust-up about choice and autonomy and freedom with ordinary people, and I think they're going to win.
Great. Can we thank our speakers and hopefully we can get off to a friendly bust-up here. So we've got a couple of mics around. There's a gentleman at the back.
Yes, I'm speaking as a committed cyclist, but I recognise that it's a privilege that I can cycle around. Not everybody can cycle in the way that I do, their lifestyles, their mobility, and so forth. And I do see the automobile as having been an incredible engine of freedom and mobility for people who otherwise couldn't get around. Old people, disabled people, people with children. There's a whole range of people who simply can't get onto their bicycles, on their moped, onto electric scooters. I live in southeast London in one of these low traffic neighbourhoods. I'm a beneficiary. Traffic has been taken off my relatively prosperous road and moved onto what are the sacrificial roads, they're sometimes called, or the boundary roads, which already had a lot of traffic on them. Now they just have even more. The thing is, it doesn't do what it says on the tin. It's been a complete failure. Without improvements to public transport, what's being done is coercive. And I think this goes to the last speaker. I think we need to give people alternatives. Public transport is the most obvious, rather than trying to coerce them. If you coerce them, either they have to make the journey anyway, in which case they're just spending a longer time, taking a longer journey in traffic, which is in practice what has happened. So overall emissions are likely to have increased. Or they just stay in their home, perhaps that's the idea, and the benefits of mobility and freedom which the automobile has brought to society have disappeared completely for large groups of people. So please bear this in mind when we have the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you very much.
I should start by declaring an interest in that I own 3 cars. They've got a combined horsepower of 1,600 between them, and they're really great fun, which is something I'll come back onto in a moment. Despite that, I agree with Simon. I think actually in city centres, simply getting from A to B is going to necessitate other means because the congestion is too difficult. And I think also electric vehicles, once the infrastructure grid issues are sorted, once the economics are sorted, there's clearly going to be a shift towards them. But I think fundamentally the automobile is here to stay. And I think there are 3 main reasons why that's going to happen. Firstly, privacy. It's not just actually about the functionality of getting A to B for a lot of people. Having your own personal space with your own personal stuff, being able to sing Living on the Prayer, the top of your voice with windows down, no one can hear. I think that's fundamental. You can't do that on a bike. Secondly, the thrill of the race. It's a great thrill to be able to drive a car, even an electric car, and be connected to the machinery and push it to the limit within the legal limits, of course. And thirdly, pride and aspiration. I'm very proud of the fact I just bought the car that I had the toy of when I was a kid. It's 28 years old, and it's great fun. I think people aspire to buy a particular kind of cars, and they're proud of them. And I'll end with these 2 cultural references. I hope I'm not the only one here who remembers that scene in Wayne's World where they're all banging their heads to the heavy bit of Bohemian Rhapsody. Couldn't do that on a scooter. And the B-side of Bohemian Rhapsody is a song by Roger Taylor called I'm in Love with My Car. I'm holding your wheel, here is your gear, I'm cruising in overdrive. Don't have to listen to anyone, we'll talk drive. Now, would he have written that about a driverless car? I very much doubt it.
Thank you very much.
I just wanted to push back a little more on the idea that bikes and e-scooters can replace cars for urban journeys for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we live in a country where it rains a great deal, and there's a comfort factor to your journey. You don't want to be arriving at work covered in rain. More importantly, I looked up the stats, and fatalities per passenger kilometre for cars is 1.1 per million passenger kilometres. For bikes, it's 19. So obviously some of those are getting hit by cars. Fair enough, if the cars weren't there, that wouldn't happen. But still, when you're on a bike, there is nothing to protect you. If you're doing 20 miles an hour on a bike in the rain, you slip, you go around a corner, you're into a piece of concrete. The physical risk to your health, I think you'll see a lot more broken bones, a lot more injuries. Cars are actually, trains are a lot safer, but cars are a reasonably safe way of traveling as long as you don't do anything particularly stupid while you're driving them. And one other quick point I was going to make is that different cities have different urban geographies. I come from Milton Keynes. Not driving is never going to fly in Milton Keynes. It's the city of the car. It's got an excellent cycle network, but again, we live in Britain. We don't live in the United States or somewhere where it's much better weather for walking and cycling. So just different places have a different context, and one national, one-size-fits-all policy isn't going to work. Different cities need different approaches.
So it's choice for you, as Hilton was saying.
If we start to argue that cars make people fat and therefore should be banned and replaced with electric cars, the next step will be to ban the telephone. It will be much healthier if we run round to the theatre and buy theatre tickets, if we jog to see our friends halfway across the city and so forth. It just illustrates the desperation and falseness of this argument. I firmly believe petrol cars are the future of all our modern societies. Of course, I'm anti-pollution. I'm, in fact, for my sins, probably the leading allotment vegetable growing gardens politician in London, if not the UK. I'm chairman of Barnet Allotment Federation, looking after £3 billion worth of real estate, preventing councils from nicking it and turning it into housing. But I would say this. Through my Sofia office, I'm funding some entrepreneurs over there. One lady who's working on some anti-pollution devices for cruise ships. If we argue that cars can be used for non-essential use, what greater non-essential use can we have than cruise ships? A huge global industry. Each cruise ship emits the same amount of pollution as 2 million diesel cars. During lockdown, there were 12 cruise ships that couldn't deplane, they couldn't disembark their passengers outside Hamburg, and there were serious illnesses breaking out in the city of Hamburg. But the cruise industry is not interested at all in abolishing diesel cars, so I think this lady may suffer. Finally, I'm a hedge fund guy, of course, and I'm backing a fund in Switzerland called Edelweiss, one of the most successful investors on the planet, literally sort of 15 to 20% compound growth every year. He is hoovering up hydrocarbon assets. He hasn't seen the market so cheap. We're getting current dividend yields of 25% on assets he's buying in Russia. The sanctions have been so poorly designed that you have to go to Switzerland to buy Russian assets.
Just a quick plug for a TED talk by a chap called Graham Conway. It's called The Contradictions of Battery-Operated Vehicles. And he's an advocate for electric cars, so he advocates for them. But he says of the 3 fully electric, hybrid, and petrol cars, fully electric are the most polluting. Hybrids are the least polluting, and petrol cars are somewhere in between. I won't go into why that is. I'm sure you can all look up the TED Talk. But the point is that I really think we missed a trick with electric cars, especially in this country. We seem to run for electric cars when actually, obviously, the move to make was to go to hybrids and then gradually, as the technology improved, reduce the amount of petrol and increase the amount of battery, especially as obviously the energy produced to power the fully electric car or the hybrid that's not from petrol is also from other hydrocarbons. So although fully electrics pollute less in the locality, they pollute more overall in terms of their production and their poor performance.
I love the New Scientist, everybody. If you want to know what green politics is about, have a look at the new Non-Scientist. In 2019, they published a piece by Adam Vaughan, The Science Behind Extinction Rebellion's 3 Climate Change Demands. The Science Behind Extinction Rebellion. And in that article, they quoted the man who's part of Extinction Rebellion's political strategy group, whose name is, of course, Rupert Reed. And he said, by 2025, old cars would have to be permanently taken off the road and not be replaced by electric models. So I think those who've said that actually the intention with the car is to ban it altogether are pretty much on the money, really, because that's certainly what XR wants. And if you look at the indulgence which they are given by the police and the authorities, and you compare it with how the police and the authorities will deal with strikers, we can see how much the establishment has bought into all of that. Now, there's one error that we have made, I think, which is everybody thinks there's going to be a very big transition to electric vehicles. If you know the amount of vehicles sold per year in Britain, it's 1.5 million or so. The number of cars on the roads are 35 million. So even if all cars were electric tomorrow, it would take you years and years to take over the stock of installed cars around Britain. Therefore, the idea that we are facing an electricity deficit because of the rise of the electric car, the transition to the electric car, sounds a great word and very technical. It's completely wrong, because we don't face that prospect of over-demand from electric vehicles for a very, very long time. Those who raise that prospect are really trying to say that we are going to lose the fuel tax benefit that the government derives from petrol or diesel cars, and therefore, in order to handle the whole situation, we are going to have to introduce road pricing, which will make sure that we get the revenues that we've lost through the transition to electric cars. They have floated road pricing for many years. It's now more civil servant policy than ever before. That's what low traffic networks are a front for. And, you know, the point that has been made from the panel about the choice for freedom and autonomy by using a normal car, that is something that is really being challenged by that whole road pricing idea. So we've got to watch out for that. And we need to remember as well, it's not just the price of, when we're talking choice, it's not just the price of a new electric car. How many models of petrol cars or diesel are there under £30,000? Anybody know in this country? Hilton will know. It's 107.
It's going down. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, and the number of electric cars that are available for under 30,000, 7. So if you want to talk choice, freedom, and so on, then it seems to me that the electric car lobby has a lot to answer in terms of the basic questions that need to be asked about it.
Useful contribution, thank you. The gentleman here, and then I'll bring the panel back in.
Okay, can I just do a quick straw poll? Who is familiar with the trolley problem? Anybody with their hand up? Yeah? So, fair few, but basically this is a moral philosophy of making the best of a bad job. It's not the trolley, which is an autonomous electric vehicle, but it relates to that. Because if I'm in an autonomous car and there is an inevitable collision, it's unavoidable, then the car has to make the best of a bad job decision. Now, that decision may be between a queue of people in a bus queue, yeah, or killing me. Now, if I was driving the car, I may make that decision to take me over the cliff. I'd be a big hero, and everybody would be like, Paul's great, you know. However, I wouldn't get any plaudits if the car made that decision, and I don't have any say-so in it. So the trolley problem is completely integral to this, and there's reams and reams of journals about the trolley problem. You read all, you can see easily, you know, little YouTube clips on this. It'll explain it all to you. It involves a fat man being thrown onto a railway track, etc. It's all done in great fun, but it's very, very serious. It's totally intractable as a philosophical problem, and it's at the heart of the problem of autonomous vehicles. We explored this last year with Edwina Curry. She was enamored of the idea of her autonomous Tesla taking her out for a Prosecco and then it driving her back. However, she'd never heard of the trolley problem, and as I say, this is integral to the problem of the whole autonomous vision, you know. With respect to electric vehicles, it is already the case. A friend of mine has an electric delivery van. It is already the case that they are more expensive to recharge out on the road than a reasonably economical, not like this fellow's high-performance cars, but a reasonably economical 40 miles per the gallon car is cheaper to refuel than recharge an electric car. So, you know, it's not just that, but it's also the zero resale value for an electric car, because once the battery's dead, that means £10,000 is going to have to be spent by anybody buying it. So you'd say goodbye to a £1,000 banger, etc. So there's a lot of problems here. They're philosophical, they're engineering, and also they're economical, and they're not all tractable.
Okay, great.
I threatened beforehand if there was a quiet lull to sing Nancy Griffith Forward Econoline, which is entirely about the freedom and autonomy for a woman in what's hinted as an abusive marriage. By her husband gives her a car and she clears off and has a new life for herself. Which is actually kind of relevant because I think there's some really interesting things emerging from all your points. One of which is very much, that the implicit thing about changes in car policy, including manufacture, but also the way the roads are organised, is that it only works if fewer people drive, and the people that do drive less. I mean, that's more or less explicit now. It's been happening for some years in a less explicit way, but I think it's more or less explicit that fewer people should drive, and the people that do drive should drive less. And I think there's a couple of a couple of problems here. I mean, one is just the very simple one that it makes driving into a luxury activity for the few, which of course it was up until about the 60s. It's quite interesting. I once looked at motorcycling casualties, and they go down dramatically in the 1960s because before that, the only accessible autonomous transport for a working class family was a motorcycle. And then when your wife gets pregnant, you get a sidecar, and she goes in the sidecar, and then she goes in the back and the kids go in the sidecar. And I tried once to ride a sidecar rig, and it's a wonder there are any working class people left alive. That's all I'm going to say. So the advent of affordable cars in the 60s was an absolute transformation for working class mobility, the idea that you could work further away, but also you could have a life that was not limited to walking distance. And of course, the implicit thing in policy now is that, or sometimes again explicit, is that life should go back to being something local for most people. Not for everybody, obviously. Important people will fly abroad and maybe have a house in another country and so forth. But that for most of us, life becomes more local. And this idea of the 15-minute city, which is like, everything you need will be within 15 minutes. Like, but if I wanted to live like that, I'd live in a village where things would be cheaper and cleaner. To be honest, so I didn't move to London to have everything within 15 minutes. And if you go out of London, of course, there isn't very much often within 15 minutes. You do need to drive to have anything. So I think that, in a sense, the automobile represents something very specific, a very specific solution to the ideal of independent freedom of movement, having a life that's not limited by where you can get on a bicycle or a bus. But in a sense, I'm less attached to that specific solution, to the ideal of freedom or autonomous movement, that you shouldn't only be able to go on somewhere where there's a bus route or a railway line, or you can cycle somewhere, that you shouldn't be limited to essentially a Victorian model of where your horizon should be. And I'm I'll stop there.
Simon, what do you think of the choice argument? Do you think that what you're advocating is kind of taking away choice from people, especially working class people who, only in recent decades been able to afford to get around?
Yeah, I guess the counter argument would be fewer cars would mean more public transport, and lots of countryside bus routes have been killed by the proliferation of the motor car, which then means the really poor people can't go anywhere because they need to have a car now, nor a bus route. I do believe in human choice. The Lord Sumption argument, he said, well, we could have a national speed limit of 20 miles an hour, and that would make road deaths zero. But of course, we don't live just to avoid death. And so it means interesting, the chap there, he said, well, there are more cycling injuries, it's more hazardous. Well, it's like 1 death per so many journeys per car, and then 11 injuries per bike. Well, I mean, maybe neither of those figures are relevant. We should have the freedom to potentially injure ourselves. I know the British Heart Foundation say actually the health benefits of cycling negates the slight higher risk of injury. The rain arguments, well, come on, let's man up. We can face a bit of rain, we're Brits. On the road space argument, like low traffic neighbourhoods, and I appreciate they're an issue, and if it's just diverting traffic elsewhere, there is this idea that the more roads, build it and they will come. Like, you build more roads, people drive more. You reduce the road space, people will have less road space to drive and will think, well, actually, I'm going to take public transport instead. I think the argument against LTNs, like, because it diverts traffic to this other road, well, just put an LTN on that other road as well, and then problem solved, right? I had some great points as well, like the thing about resources. Yeah, I mean, the mining thing, people often say, oh yeah, well, where'd the minerals come from? I saw there's a film called Blood on the Mobile. A lot of the Congolese miners are like, I won't do the accent, but they're like, well, the NGOs are coming here and they want to take away our livelihood, and they are happy to go into the mines. You can have clean mining conditions. I mean, is the argument against mining, are we going to stop using like plastic buttons on our clothing? Are we going to stop using our iPhones? I just see this uniquely, batteries require mining. I mean, lots of things require mining. Is all mining bad? And you can recycle. Like there was a PR company paid for by General Motors, and their conclusion was driving a Humvee 10 miles is more eco-friendly than driving a Toyota Prius 10 miles due to the production costs. And it turns out their figures were made up. A Humvee wasn't more eco-friendly than a semi-electric car. So I think we do need to look into those figures and people that say that. On the AI...
Okay, can you save that point? Because we're...
Sure.
Nigel, could you give us a couple of
I had some points here from the audience questions, but I just want to pick up the mining point. I've just stepped down as a CFO of a cobalt mining business, and in ethical parts of the world, that was the pitch. The conditions in the Congo, where most of the cobalt comes from, are absolutely horrendous, and the child slave labour and all the rest of it there is just off the scale. And it's largely controlled by warlords, and a lot of it is controlled by China. The Uyghurs in China is about minerals. It's not actually about a religious thing particularly. That's the catalyst. It's about control. So we've got a big, sort of massive geopolitical thing that's come in here in terms of all batteries for the phones and everything. At the minute, it comes from, is reliant on mining in some pretty difficult parts of the world. The prices, as Hilton said, are going through the roof. So what you're seeing with the electric vehicles is the economies of scale are starting to kick in. The prices of manufacturers are starting to come down. There's a long way to go, but they're getting there. But the cost of the minerals is going through the roof because there's constrictions to supply. And then you've got a big brand issue once people start to realise where this stuff really comes from. And I think Apple have said they're now not going to be using, they're going to control the supply chain, and they're not going to be buying from any source that comes from the Congo or wherever. So the whole mining thing is quite complicated, but if you do want any sort of, everything comes out the earth, it's mined in some shape or form. If you want any sort, you want a bicycle, it has come from mining. So there's it's one of these examples where people have got to face up to the realities of the debate here and not just sort of gloss over it. And I think that really extends into the whole net zero debate. You look at the electric vehicle, Volvo's own numbers, so that there's 40% more carbon in the production of their new design for the electric XC40. So to make it, the running costs obviously are cheaper, but you've got to drive it for about 60,000 miles before there's a net carbon gain. So that's completely undermining the headline that we need to move to EV rapidly to save the planet. That's not going to work. And then you factor in the carbon cost of building a new factory, because the lowest carbon is what you've got. The car that you've got, you've done the carbon on that. If you replace it with an EV, you've just introduced more carbon into the environment. So there's a...
Okay. We're running out of time, so keep it brief.
I only have to race through this.
Okay.
First thing is, I started writing about pollution in 2004 in reference to the congestion charge. I had a huge 10 years on Comment is Free on The Guardian in the evenings, arguing with people about the difference between pollution and CO2. Nobody ever died of breathing CO2 in. So really, when you're talking about the move to the electric car, you've got two things. You've got what comes out of the tailpipe, which you might not want, and you've got the whole cost, the whole energy to build the car. So as somebody was just saying, the best thing to do, is to keep the car you've got. And one of the things I'm working on at the moment, because I don't write for Old Car very often because they're very electric now, is the idea that we should actually build internal combustion engine cars that are designed to last for at least 20 years, which is entirely possible, and more to the point, be a damn sight cheaper than an electric car. So really, I think we've come at this from the backwards way. In the pursuit of low pollution, when we went to diesel because it was low CO2, I said to everybody, no, it sticks out lots of pollution. California doesn't allow diesel. Everybody ignored me and everybody else. And now we've got lots of diesel cars causing pollution. Oh, well, what we need to do is clean up the tailpipes, so we'll go to electric cars. Completely the wrong way around. Petrol engines now are so clean. In fact, in California, they had, before the electric cars started in the last few years, they had things called super ultra low emission vehicles, which were petrol engines. And when they say emissions, they mean petrol. And it was almost impossible outside the lab to measure the pollution coming out the tailpipe. So what we should have done was stay with the petrol and either gone, okay, what we're going to do is make them last 20 years. We're going to have, instead of having factories making cars, we have factories refurbishing cars. Or Toyota's saying it's going to do that. Peugeot said it's going to do that. Renault said it's going to do that. Because I was fascinated by what you said, because the people who run the car industry are really serious people. But the diesel issue was really specifically Volkswagen and some really bad illegal behaviour in the States. But the people who run car businesses are really clever, and I'm fascinated by what you say, because the whole shift to electric is going to come to a crunching halt before 2030, which is why the Mini factory has lost the electric Mini, because if this happens, Cowley will be rebuilt, or Oxford will be built to make electric Minis. But BMW, being a team of engineers, are saying, we're going to hold on this, because it might not happen. And in fact, the final thing I'll say is, a chap when I had my magazine, a chap who was a Lotus engineer wrote a piece for me and said, if I was ruling the world, I would make methanol from solar power. He was at Bath Spa University. He has just been hoovered up by an unnamed university in the Middle East to go and make this happen. So Saudi, as the guy said, the Stone Age didn't end because they ran out of stone. The internal combustion engine era will not die because of a lack of fuel. It's going to come back because I think the Middle East is going to bring out methanol, which is e-fuel. It's CO2-free liquid fuel, energy dense. Very quickly, if you made 1 million cars a year, you'd probably buy a fuel tank, blow molded plastic fuel tank. You might pay $30 each if you bought 1 million a year. The fuel tank in an electric car, depending on its size, is $10,000, $12,000. And that's basically what you're doing. It's the fuel tank. So I think what's going to happen is the Middle East is going to appear out of nowhere in 2029 and go, here you go, methanol. And the non-affluent parts of the world will switch to methanol. And we'll all be stuck here in our 3-ton electric cars with massive carbon footprints. People are unable to afford them.
Okay, great. We've got about 10 minutes left for audience.
So we have a lot of arguments against and for electric vehicles. I actually work with electric vehicles. I disagree with a lot of the arguments, but I'm not going to convince any one of you right now. What we haven't talked about is car ownership. Car ownership model now is you buy your car and that sits on your drive for 90% of the time at a very minimum. We don't use cars as much as we should. They are sat there, there's 100 people on a road that all have 100 cars, all take up 100 cars worth of space, all take up 100 cars worth of carbon dioxide to make. The car ownership model needs to change. We need to, zip car, rental needs to change. We need to develop systems where, 10 people share one car and you share that CO2 across people. It does take away some freedom, but freedom is a privilege that climate change does take away from. And I think, that's a part of this debate that hasn't been talked about a lot. And I think it's an interesting point to address.
Brilliant, thank you.
I think having cars is just too useful for transporting washing machines and Billy bookcases and golf clubs. But we do need to reduce the impact. And I have got some ideas. Simple ideas for reducing the impact of cars. One is having more one-way streets in local neighbourhoods. So instead of having no cars, you have a one-way street where you could then have a bike lane or more parking. The second idea is standardising all of these bicycles that you can rent. There seems to be about 4 or 5 different companies now, and I never seem to have the right app for that bike. The third idea is having more multi-storey car parks on the edge of cities where you could have your second or third vehicle parked up in that multi-storey, and then you use your micro electric vehicle to go around the city. But when you do that long distance journey to Wales, you change over with your second car or you rent a car efficiently in the multi-storey. The final idea is, with that multi-storey option available, more people can switch over to small electric vehicles. And as Mr. Nasher said, that we could have, we should have a law against these big, heavy vehicles. So certainly these SUVs are unnecessary for 99% of people.
All right, thank you very much.
I just had a very quick point to make about the viability of adopting electric vehicles en masse in the coming years, which I think Nigel touched on very, very briefly, was just about grid capacity. So it's something that doesn't really ever seem to get talked about much, but I do believe that, you know, if everybody were to adopt in this country electric vehicles en masse, electricity production in the UK would have to more or less double to reach that, which is obviously a huge undertaking, and obviously something you would have to question, does the country really want to be doing that as well? So I'd be interested to know if anyone on the panel had any views about that.
Okay. I'm a resident of Manchester, and I was just wondering if the panel wanted to discuss, you know, this debate in the context of Manchester. Specifically, they're introducing a clean air zone at the moment in Manchester. This is something that likely would be coming to other cities such as Birmingham and Leeds, I believe. And second point was around buses. Before the general election, Boris Johnson stood in front of a big train and promised improvement to the public transport network, mostly trains, but also, you know, Boris buses. I don't know if we've had much of that. We did, Andy Burnham did go get some funding for some buses recently, and I think he got slightly less than he had hoped. But anything about Manchester from the panel would be appreciated.
Okay. The thing about electric cars is I do agree that the move to electric cars isn't a move to electric cars, it's a move to no cars. And I smell a rat, because I think what it is that all the rich and powerful people are just making sure that all the yoiks get off the road.
Thank you very much.
Just like to thank everyone for contributions here, particularly the gentleman over here talking about the trolley effect. Not something I'd heard of before. It does rather call into question the viability of the London Mayor's pet project known as Vision Zero, the elimination of all road deaths and serious injuries by, I think it's 2041. I really can't see how this can be helped by self-driving cars if they're going to trolley off into bus queues instead of going up a cliff. But I think they are being promoted as a magic solution to road accidents and the like. Please forgive me if I'm sceptical about the whole issue of Vision Zero. I'm not sure that technology will make it literally true. That's all from me, thank you.
Right.
If you look around the world, a lot of the strikes that have happened in the past year have been to do with transport, or go back a bit. The Gilets jaunes in France, the truckers in Canada, the RMT in this country. And it's in that context that we have to remember that the working class involved in transport usually has quite a wide-ranging vision, works hard, is respected by the public, skilled. Therefore, what is going to happen in this country when all new vehicles are legislated to not contain anything more than hybrid quantities of fossil fuels from 2030, and from 2035 you're not even allowed a hybrid? Does the panel think that this will be met by no resistance from motorists? Does it think that motorists will, in fact, prolong the life of their internal combustion engines, so all the old heaps and jalopies that we already see, average age 11 years on British roads, that will go to 15 or 16 so that people don't have to buy electric cars?
Okay, thank you very much. And the last point from the audience at the back, just very briefly.
The smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow a very lively debate within that spectrum. Noam Chomsky said that in a book called The Common Good. Now, this whole debate is about solving two non-problems. It's CO2, that there's a climate emergency. There is no climate emergency. And the idea of pollution, nitrous oxides, particulates, the idea that 40,000 people die a year, right, is disputable, right? Without going into the technicalities of it, there are lots of people who live in northern regions, right, ex-coal mining regions that have pristine air, where their longevity and their health is much poorer than people who live in the economically advantaged south or in London itself. And the biggest signifier of health is income, right? And the car aids people's freedom and it aids people's income.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to bring the speakers in reverse order to sum up. We've got 6 minutes, but I would just like to say that having been involved in fighting road closures and campaigns over the last 2 years and trying to organise debates and discussions across Hackney and Islington, it's been really, really hard finding anyone who will come and debate from the opposite point of view. So I really appreciate that we've been able to have this discussion today with a real range of views. So that's really important. So thank you very much, and we've got 6 minutes. So give us 2 minutes.
Okay.
And,
choice and freedom is all, particularly for working class people where I grew up. I'm old enough to remember the whole of Leyland Motors going to work on bicycles in the mid-70s. And now they don't have to. There is no Leyland Motors, but anyway. The future is autonomy and freedom. The future is petrol-engined hybrids. The future will be synthetic fuels, either cracked hydrogen from nuclear or methanol from the Middle East. As for trolleyology, I'm sorry everybody wasted their time, but if you get in a modern car, go to a manufacturer, cars that do automatic braking from 20 miles an hour can stop quicker than a human in slippery shoes. And I'm completely serious. Trolleyology isn't a thing. And all I can say is, yes, it's too crowded in town, but people really need to have the choice and the freedom and the affordability, because it's the biggest lift to your quality of life.
Great, thank you very much. Simon, can you...
Yeah, about the vision of the national grid. Imagining, I'm stealing someone else's words from a previous session, 1751. Oh, I'm burning wood in my house. What's this coal thing? Electricity. What, you're going to put like light bulbs on every single building in the entire country and run this national grid? That is mental. I think we could actually electrify cars. And the chap at the back said it's 1.5 million cars produced a year. So inevitably, it is a slow change to electric cars, and I think the national grid could deal with that. I think autonomous vehicles are quite dangerous. We already have, I think there is potentially a conspiracy. New cars seem to have dazzlingly bright headlights. They make it very unpleasant to drive and to cycle. And actually, a friend of mine here who was a victim of ABS, because the car in front, it stopped because of some leaves. He crashed into the back. Legally, the liability was his for crashing into the back of the car. So already this trolley problem is actually just based on the law and not good. I think we should try and emulate the Netherlands. They have bicycles everywhere. Children are taken to school on bicycle. Disabled people can still use cars and small electric vehicles, and they have less obesity and better health. And I think that's a good vision for the UK and the world. So that would be my vision for the future.
Great, thank you very much for keeping in time. Nigel, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just pick up on the Manchester point, but I might just move the answer to Norway. We're seeing clean air zones come in. I think part of the M6, I think, is now down to 60 miles an hour to cut pollution. We're seeing reduction in speed limits. Wales, I think, is dropping the 30 to a 20, and local authorities can put it up to a 30 if they want to. So there's keeping the speed limits low. I think and it's not really a fuel debate in some senses, but there is a constant aversion to the car that we're seeing. There's a lot of regulation that's coming in. I was on my motorbike in Norway not that long ago, and that has 50% penetration of electric vehicles. They're a long, long way ahead of us. But the grid can't cope. So it is an 80-kilometre blanket speed limit. So you are going along these fantastic fuels, fantastic roads, not a car, not a person in sight, apart from the technology that's making you allow you to go above 80 kilometres an hour. So congratulations on your horsepower. I suggest you use it soon, because in the not too distant future you won't have a licence. But and this is I mentioned earlier, this is about the regulation that's coming down the pipe. I think cars will continue but I do think they're going to become pretty boring if we're not careful.
Great, thank you very much. Timandra, can you finish us off, please?
It's going to finish you off, isn't it? Just because I started talking about risk. So I like Simon's optimism about human capacity to solve problems and change things. And I like the way you look historically and say, well, look, you know, in the 18th century, lots of things we have now seemed impossible. So I would like to see a future where we can produce enough electricity, nuclear, to make all vehicles electric, if we can solve the battery problem, which, you know, I think these are technological problems and we can solve. But I think the other problem is a political problem. And, you know, in the block where I live, I'm actually probably one of the people that needs a car least, because of the other people. One is it has a blue badge. He's got mobility issues. Another is 92, so he's got mobility issues, as you'd expect. Most of the other people have a lot of small children. You know, pretty much everyone else in my block has things that they really need cars for. But I don't want to start playing that game of, well, actually, a lot of people really need a car, because I think the point is, it's not really down to any of us to look at other people's lives and judge whether they really need a car. You know, I mean, my mum grew up without an inside toilet and hot water, so we don't really need inside toilets and hot water. But I'm glad we live in a world where those things are now seen as normal. I think the thing we really need to tackle is not an engineering problem. It's the problem of the vision that freedom is a privilege and choice is a privilege, and that we can't have that anymore because we've all been awful and we've been selfish and we've ruined the planet. I think that freedom and choice are human values that we should defend, and we should harness human ingenuity to find engineering solutions that mean we can expand that choice and not restrict it.
Great, thank you. Can we thank our panel? Thank you to everyone. That's it.